It was the kind of place you don't talk about, not in polite conversation, not in any public setting. It was a lost city, buried beneath the dense rainforest of Central America, hidden away from the world for centuries, and for good reason. Dr. Charles Bennett was the leader of the expedition, a seasoned archaeologist with decades of experience under his belt. His team had heard the rumors, the stories passed down by locals about a city that had once thrived deep in the jungle, only to mysteriously disappear without a trace. Now, in the summer of 2023, he and his crew were setting out to uncover the truth. They thought it would be another typical archaeological dig, uncovering ancient ruins, deciphering ancient texts, and piecing together the past. But as they ventured deeper into the jungle, the atmosphere grew tense, thick with a palpable unease. The humidity was stifling, the air thick with the scent of decay, and every rustling sound in the distance felt like a warning. When they finally found the ruins, it was more than they expected. The city, though buried for so long, was remarkably well preserved. Towering stone structures, intricate carvings, and strange, almost otherworldly symbols adorned the walls. But as they ventured further into the heart of the ruins, they found something that shouldn't have been there: a series of old, weathered journals. Charles flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The entries were filled with strange, fragmented accounts of experiments, strange rituals, and whispers of people who had vanished without a trace. The final entry was the most chilling. "We did not anticipate this. The city is alive. It is feeding on us." The team exchanged uneasy glances. The words echoed in Charles's mind. It didn't make sense. How could a city be alive? They brushed it off as the ramblings of a long-dead civilization, caught in the grip of some ancient, misguided belief. But the further they explored, the more they realized that the city wasn't just old, it was cursed, and the curse was very real. As night fell and the team set up camp amidst the ruins, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped suddenly, far colder than it should have been for the tropical jungle. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence, and in the distance, Charles swore he saw shadows moving, not from the jungle, but from the ruins themselves. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. One of the team members, Sarah, had taken an interest in the carvings that lined the walls of a crumbling temple. She was photographing them when her camera malfunctioned. A low, mechanical hum began to fill the air, and then, in the blink of an eye, Sarah screamed. Charles rushed to her side. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was pointing at something on the wall, her hands trembling. Look at this," she whispered. The carvings on the wall had changed. The images that were once static now seemed to shift, moving as if alive. They depicted twisted, distorted figures, humanoid shapes with features that seemed almost human but not quite. There was something unnatural about them. But then, something more unsettling happened. The shadow of a figure seemed to manifest from the carvings, stretching unnaturally long, like a black smoke reaching from the wall. It was impossible to ignore the fact that something in the city was watching them, something ancient, something alive. Before anyone could react, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The rumble grew louder and louder, and the stone temple began to crack and groan. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. Sarah collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, as if the very air had turned toxic. Charles and the rest of the team rushed to her side, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the shaking only intensified. The entire structure seemed to be shifting, like it was alive, reacting to their presence. "Get out!" shouted one of the other team members, a geologist named Jason. "Now! This place is unstable." But it was already too late. The ground cracked wide open, swallowing the temple in a massive, gaping chasm. The team barely managed to scramble away, narrowly avoiding the collapse. As they stumbled into the clearing, gasping for air, Charles's mind raced. What had just happened? Was it an earthquake, or something else entirely? The feeling that they weren't alone, that something was lurking just out of sight, refused to leave him. They didn't have much time to process what had happened. Sarah was still unconscious, her breathing shallow, and the others were on edge, barely holding it together. But as they made their way back to camp, something caught Charles's eye. A shadow, moving against the wind. It wasn't an animal, it was too tall, too wrong. He tried to dismiss it as his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, the jungle was filled with strange creatures, but deep down, he knew that what they had uncovered was far darker than any of them could have ever anticipated. And as they settled down for the night, the jungle seemed to grow even quieter. The oppressive silence hung heavy, and Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the city was watching them, that it was waiting for something. But what? This story seems to be getting scarier, doesn't it? If you want more stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps create even more scary for you. The night was unbearable. The oppressive silence that hung over the camp was broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Yet even that didn't seem to comfort the team. The unease had set in like a thick fog, each of them wrapped in their own thoughts, struggling to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Sarah had regained consciousness but was still disoriented. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Charles could tell she was on the verge of a breakdown, but there was something more, something beyond the obvious physical trauma she had endured. She was terrified of something they couldn't yet understand. "Charles," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw it. I saw them." "Who?" he asked, crouching beside her, trying to keep his voice calm. "The figures. The ones in the wall. They weren't just carvings, they were alive. I saw them move. They were watching us, waiting for us." Her words sent a chill down Charles's spine. He couldn't deny the growing sense of dread that gripped him, but he dismissed her fears. "It was probably just your mind playing tricks, the stress of the situation." "No," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You don't understand. They're not just carvings, they are the city." The others, sitting in the darkness around the fire, exchanged uneasy glances. Charles stood up and tried to maintain his composure. He needed to keep the group focused, but deep down, something felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. As the night stretched on, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He had heard the rustling of footsteps in the jungle, but when he turned, no one was there. The wind had stopped, and the air felt thick, as if the entire jungle had gone still, watching. The next morning, they decided to continue their exploration, despite the growing unease that plagued every step they took. The ruins seemed to stretch endlessly before them, more intricate and vast than they could have ever imagined. The deeper they ventured, the more they realized that this wasn't just a city. It was something far more significant, a forgotten monument to something darker, more ancient. In the center of the ruins, they discovered a massive structure that seemed unlike any temple they had encountered. It was a pyramid, towering and imposing, its stone surface covered in the same strange symbols they had seen throughout the city. The air around the pyramid felt thick, almost suffocating, and as they approached, Charles noticed that the stone beneath his feet felt warmer than it should have been. "This doesn't feel right," Jason said, his voice low and cautious. "We should turn back. This whole place, it's wrong." But Charles, driven by his obsession with discovery, pressed forward. "We're this close. We can't turn back now." They climbed the steep stone steps of the pyramid, the weight of the air around them growing heavier with each step. When they reached the top, they found a large, stone door embedded into the structure. It was covered in the same carvings, but unlike the others, these seemed different. They seemed active, as if they were shifting in the light. This is it," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they conducted the experiments." The team gathered around, trying to decipher the symbols. Charles had studied the ancient languages, but these were unlike anything he had ever seen. There was an underlying sense of urgency in the carvings, almost like a warning. As they stood there, studying the door, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently. The pyramid groaned, and for a split second, Charles could swear the walls of the structure began to pulse, as if it were breathing. "We need to get out of here," Sarah urged, panic creeping into her voice. But it was too late. The door slowly creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. A faint, flickering light came from within, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Charles, despite his reservations, stepped forward, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. "Stay close," he ordered, as he led the team into the passage. The air inside the pyramid was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls of the passage were lined with more symbols, but as they moved deeper into the structure, they noticed something even more disturbing. Every so often, they would pass a chamber, and inside, the faintest glimpse of something alive. At first, it was nothing more than fleeting shadows, figures that vanished before their eyes. But the deeper they went, the more they saw. There were things, twisted, unnatural shapes, caught in the dark corners of the chambers. Human-like figures, but deformed, their skin stretched tight across their bones, their eyes wide and unblinking. "We're not alone," whispered Jason, his voice trembling. "Those things, they're not human." The others froze, their eyes scanning the dark passage ahead. But before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them shifted again, and the passageway seemed to pulse, as if responding to their presence. Suddenly, the flickering light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter, casting an unnatural glow against the walls. It illuminated a massive chamber at the heart of the pyramid. At the center of the chamber, there was an altar, but it was unlike any altar they had ever seen. This one was covered in strange, almost organic material, pulsating with life, and above it, carved into the stone ceiling, was a symbol that none of them recognized, a symbol that seemed to call to them. "This is where it all began," Charles muttered under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is where they experimented." As they stepped forward, they could feel the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on them. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows moving ever closer, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Charles felt his pulse quicken, his breathing shallow. He had uncovered the truth about the city, but now, as the altar loomed before him, he realized that the truth was far more horrifying than he had ever imagined. And then, from the darkness, came a voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably human. "You should never have come here." The voice was unmistakably human, but it had an eerie, unnatural quality to it, like the speaker was part of the very darkness surrounding them. The sound echoed off the stone walls, and for a moment, Charles and the team were frozen in place, hearts racing in their chests. "Who's there?" Charles demanded, his voice trembling despite his best effort to sound calm. He took a step forward, eyes scanning the shadows. There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop even further, and Charles could see his breath clouding in the air. The flickering light from the far end of the passageway cast strange, shifting shadows along the walls, making it nearly impossible to tell where the voice had come from. Sarah clutched Charles's arm, her body tense. "We need to leave this place. It's alive." Jason, who had been standing a little farther back, looked at the others, his face pale. "We should have never come here. This isn't an archaeological site, it's a tomb meant for something worse." Charles shook his head, but his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. "We can't leave yet, not until we know what's really happening here." Suddenly, the light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter again, and the sound of the distant voice stopped, but the tension in the air only grew thicker, almost suffocating. It was as if the very stones of the pyramid were alive, shifting and groaning, reacting to their presence. "I'm not sure I can take much more of this," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "This place is cursed." Before anyone could respond, a low rumble vibrated through the floor beneath them. The ground seemed to shudder, and the walls began to tremble, as if the pyramid itself was awakening from some ancient slumber. A figure appeared in the shadows. It wasn't human. The thing that stepped into the dim light was tall, unnaturally thin, and its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones. Its limbs were impossibly long, like something out of a nightmare, and its face was devoid of expression, its eyes too large, too dark. It was a person, but not quite. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Charles's heart raced, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature. It stared at him, or at least, he assumed it was staring, but there was no warmth in those eyes, No humanity, just cold, empty voids. The creature's mouth opened, and for a moment, Charles thought it might speak. Instead, it let out a terrible, guttural hiss, as if it were struggling to communicate. The air grew heavier still, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. "Run!" Sarah screamed, breaking the silence and grabbing Charles's arm, pulling him toward the passageway they had come from. "We have to get out of here." But the creature moved with startling speed. In an instant, it was right in front of them, blocking their way. The air was thick with a rancid, metallic smell, and Charles could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He tried to take a step back, but his body felt frozen, as if he was rooted to the spot. "Stay back," Jason shouted, but the creature didn't react to his warning. Instead, it tilted its head, the motion eerie and unnatural, as if it were sizing them up, deciding what to do next. Charles swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. What is it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's one of them," Sarah said, her face pale with fear. "The people who were here, the ones who never left, the experiments, they didn't die, they changed." The creature took a slow step forward, and Charles's heart lurched. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. It was as if the very presence of this thing was holding him captive, freezing him in place. Jason was the first to snap out of it. He lunged forward, grabbing a nearby piece of stone debris, and hurled it at the creature. The rock bounced harmlessly off its hideous form, but the creature's reaction was immediate. It let out a low, guttural growl and lunged at Jason with terrifying speed. Jason barely had time to react as the creature's long, spindly fingers wrapped around his throat. His eyes bulged as he struggled to break free, but the creature's grip tightened. "Jason!" Sarah screamed, but there was nothing they could do. With one swift motion, the creature lifted Jason off the ground and threw him against the stone wall. He crumpled to the floor, motionless. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Charles could barely believe what he had just seen. The creature had killed Jason without any effort. It was as if they were nothing more than prey to it, nothing but ants beneath the foot of a predator. "We have to go now," Charles said, his voice hoarse. His mind was racing. They were not prepared for this. None of them had anticipated this. They had stumbled into something far darker than they could ever have imagined. With one last glance at Jason's lifeless body, they turned and fled down the passageway, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The creature didn't follow them immediately, but they could hear its movement behind them fast, too fast as it tracked their every step. They reached the entrance of the pyramid, but as they ran toward the exit, the ground shook again, this time with more force. The pyramid seemed to groan, its ancient stones shifting as if some ancient force was waking up. "We're not going to make it," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We're all going to die here." Charles didn't have an answer. He didn't know how they would escape. All he knew was that whatever the city was, whatever these things were, they had been waiting for someone, for them, to disturb the peace that had existed for centuries. And now, there was no turning back. Panic had fully taken hold of Charles as they sprinted through the corridors of the pyramid, each step filled with a sense of urgency. The once silent, oppressive air now seemed to crackle with an energy of its own, a weight that threatened to crush them at every turn. The creature, that twisted, inhuman thing, was still behind them, moving far too fast for anything they had ever seen before. It had claimed one of them already, and Charles couldn't let it take anyone else. "Faster!" Sarah cried, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footfalls. Her breath was ragged, her face drenched with sweat, and her eyes wide with terror. "We have to get out of here, now!" They rounded another corner, and Charles's heart skipped a beat. The entrance was close, just ahead. He could see the faint light of the jungle outside beginning to filter through the stone, but it felt like an eternity away. Every instinct in his body screamed that they were not going to make it. Every fiber of his being told him they were too late. The ground beneath their feet shook again, more violently this time. It felt like the entire pyramid was trembling, as if the very stones of the ancient city were coming to life. The pulse of energy from the heart of the pyramid was overwhelming now. It was as if the place itself was awakening, sensing that the intruders were trying to escape. "We need to move now," Charles shouted, his voice barely carrying over the noise. His eyes flicked back toward the dark passage, expecting to see that grotesque figure looming behind them. And then, the unmistakable sound of its movement came again, faster, closer. They were running out of time. Just as they neared the final stretch toward the exit, Sarah stumbled. Her foot caught on something, an ancient stone that jutted out of the floor. She fell to the ground, a scream of pain escaping her lips. Charles turned around, panic flooding through him. "Sarah, get up," he shouted, reaching out to pull her to her feet. But the moment he touched her arm, a horrible, screeching noise filled the air, like metal scraping against stone. The creature appeared before them, blocking the exit. It was faster now, more aggressive, its twisted body even more contorted and grotesque than before. Its eyes locked on them, no longer cold and empty, but filled with hunger. It was no longer merely observing them, it was hunting them. Sarah's scream pierced the air as the creature lunged. "Run!" Charles shouted again, pulling Sarah to her feet as he pushed her forward toward the exit. He turned just in time to see the creature's long fingers reaching for him. Its grip would be like a vice, crushing him in seconds, but he didn't have time to hesitate. He sprinted forward, his legs burning with exhaustion. The moment they burst into the daylight, the oppressive atmosphere of the pyramid lifted, but only for a moment. The jungle outside was eerily silent, the air thick with a heaviness that made it feel like they were suffocating. It was as though the very jungle itself had been waiting for their return. But as they ran, Charles noticed something. The ground beneath their feet was shifting. The stone pyramid they had just escaped from was trembling, the entire structure groaning as if it were alive. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, he realized what had happened. The city wasn't just a collection of ruins, it was a living organism. It had been dormant for centuries, feeding off the energy and life force of those who dared to enter, and it had been waiting for them. The creature, those twisted beings, were not simply the remnants of the people who once lived there. They were its guardians, its protectors, its prisoners. The pyramid was alive, and it had woken up the moment they stepped inside. "Keep moving," Sarah shouted, snapping Charles back to the present. They were running blindly now, dodging through the dense jungle, branches scratching at their faces as they fought their way towards safety. But as they ran, the truth began to settle in. The creature that had attacked them, it wasn't a freak accident. It wasn't some random monster. It was a manifestation of the city itself, a guardian sent to protect its secrets, and they had unleashed something far darker than they could have imagined. The jungle seemed to close in around them as they pushed through the undergrowth. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch underfoot, felt like a threat. They could feel it. The city wasn't done with them. It wasn't going to let them leave. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, they broke through the trees and stumbled into an open clearing. The sunlight felt like a blessing, but even then, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. And then, they heard it, the sound of the creature, still following them. Its inhuman screech echoed through the trees. "Go! Keep going!" Charles yelled, pushing Sarah ahead of him as they made their way to a nearby river. But as they neared the water, the jungle fell into a deathly silence. The wind stopped. The creatures of the jungle, birds, insects, even the wind itself, were gone. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the water in the river began to bubble violently. Charles turned, his blood running cold. The city was not letting them escape. The creature was close. But just as the creature's shadow loomed in the distance, something unexpected happened. The ground cracked open. A deafening roar echoed through the jungle as the river surged upward, swallowing everything in its path. It was as if the city itself was fighting back, trying to reclaim what it had lost. The creature, too, seemed to hesitate for a moment, but that hesitation was enough. In a split second, the earth split further, and the river swallowed it whole, dragging the creature and the pyramid down into the depths of the earth. For a brief moment, all was still. Charles and Sarah stood there, breathless and covered in dirt and sweat, watching the remnants of the pyramids sink into the ground. The jungle was silent, save for the faint sound of rushing water. They had escaped, but at what cost? Charles looked at Sarah, her face pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and terror. The city, the creatures, the horrors they had witnessed, it was all gone, but Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they had left something behind. The truth. They had uncovered something that was never meant to be found, something ancient and horrifying. And now, with the city gone, the jungle once again seemed peaceful. But deep down, Charles knew the truth. It wasn't over. The city, the creatures, the curse, it was still out there, waiting for the next fool to wander too close. And that thought haunted him as they walked away from the wreckage, forever changed by the horrors they had uncovered. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts on this terrifying story, and subscribe for more spine-chilling horror tales.